19. Cass jogged through the identical-looking corridors, thinking the Coalition could help everyone out if they color-coded the different sections of the ship. Every corridor looked like the last, an infinite series of dark gray panels and lit walls. He didn't have long. Tyler might have heard too much. He'd already turned off his comm in the event they tried to get in contact with him. But that cut off all his access. He had no clue how much they already knew. He increased his pace. Cass stopped as soon as he'd reached Bay 2, opposite where he'd originally parked the reasonable excuse, back when she'd still been in one piece. It almost made him nostalgic, thinking about sitting up with Box in the ship while they hunted the Atlas. What would they do to Box once he left? They'd be able to see he hadn't sent Box any coded messages, and hopefully they wouldn't suspect him of any treachery. Cass couldn't contact him now, not if he wanted to keep all suspicion off him. If his plan didn't work, none of it would matter anyway, and he'd be lucky to even get back alive. Cass recognized one of the crewmen working on some minor repairs along the wall. It appeared as if some of the bulkheads had buckled in the short battle, and he was in the process of replacing them. "Abernathy, isn't it?" he asked. "Yeah," Abernathy replied, looking away from his work. "Can you help me a minute? We're headed back into Sill space soon, and the captain wanted me to perform a readiness evaluation on the Space Wing fighters." Abernathy's eyes narrowed. "We just sent up an evaluation before we entered Sill space." "Were any of the units damaged? We took quite a few hits," Cass said. "The fighters are fine," Abernathy said. "The pilots are all on standby." "What about the shuttles?" Abernathy sighed. "Look, if you're so concerned, take a look for yourself. I have a job to finish here, and if these bulkheads aren't repaired by the time we get underway—" Cass put up his hands, as if to say no more. He excused himself, catching glances from the pilots and technicians of the Space Wing fighters on the far side of the bay. Those would be his biggest concern. With the ship basically at a standstill, he wasn't worried about it coming after him. But he'd need a few minutes with the long-range shuttle before he could open an undercurrent. He did his best to ignore them and made his way to where the 14 shuttles in this bay remained parked. They were in the back of the bay, which meant he'd have to fly the shuttle past some of the Space Wings, and Korn knew he wasn't the best pilot. In fact, if he got the ship out of the bay without hitting something, it would be a miracle. He took note of the first shuttle's name. Calypso. Sounded like a winner to him. Cass boarded the shuttle and shut the doors on the side, locking them in place. He made his way to the front and began the shuttle's startup sequence. It took a moment for everything to light up. "First things first," Cass said, reconfiguring the controls to Box's favorite settings. It would help him to know where everything was in a pinch. And there might be some pinches. As best he knew, these shuttles had minimal weapons. They were most often used for dignitaries or moving cargo. The Space Wings were the fighters. But somehow, being back in the cramped space reminded Cass of his old ship. And this was technically a diplomatic mission, so the shuttle was at least being put to good use. Moving fast, he made a connection to the ship's computer and downloaded all of the information he'd found in engineering to his personal server. He also pulled a copy of the telescope recordings and bundled them together. It was everything he'd need. Double-checking the undercurrent drive, Cass took a deep breath, staring out into the bay at all the people moving around doing their jobs, not paying him much attention. If being on the ship for 30 days had been good for one thing, it was acclimating himself to the crew. They got used to seeing him around, which made them lower their guard. He took one last look at the controls. If he did this, there was no coming back. And if he didn't make it to the undercurrent before the Space Wing stopped him, then he'd be in the brig for sure, and the mission would be dead in the water. But traditional tactics weren't going to work with the Sill. He had to do something drastic. Cass engaged the hover mode, and the shuttle lifted off from the pad. He immediately threw the throttle forward, turning the small craft as he did, and it jerked ahead, nearly slamming into the wall before rotating to the left to face the exit. People scrambled around the bay. and 2 jumped in front of it, waving their hands. Cass hit the accelerator, and the shuttle shot forward faster than he'd intended. The 2 people jumped out of the way, but he was sure he'd clipped one of them. He caught the surprised face of Abernathy as the shuttle rocketed past him through the force barrier and into open space. Other than possibly striking a crew member, it had been a collision-free exit. He could only hope they were okay. Cass began the startup procedures for an undercurrent jump, heading for where the Tempest last came through. He could piggyback through the undercurrent the ship had made before it faded too much. As he was focused on flying the shuttle straight, the proximity alarm went off. He tapped a button, showing him the rear view from the shuttle, and 3 of the Space Wing fighters had been dispatched to follow him. Unavoidable, Cass muttered, as a comm blast came through the shuttle systems. He turned it off, not wanting to try and explain or listen to whatever Captain Greene had to say. Greene would never approve this mission, and Cass didn't need to hear the threats. It wasn't like he hadn't heard it all before. One of the fighters opened fire, the blast rocketing past him on the right. A warning shot. They would go for his engines first, and they were already closing. His only chance was the undercurrent. The Space Wings didn't have generators on their own, so they couldn't enter, not even an established current, as the risk would be too great they could be crushed by the intense gravity inside. He pulled back on the accelerator and yanked up, sending the shuttle straight up with little time to adjust. His insides felt like jelly, but he had to do something until he reached the current. He only needed a few more moments. A blast struck the shuttle on the side, and the computer blinked an indication of a breach. He could make it with a breach. He'd made much worse than the excuse. Not enough, he said, tapping the controls so the shuttle went into a barrel roll, though it wasn't really designed as a maneuverable craft. He could only imagine what the other pilots were seeing. Maybe if he made them think he was crazy, they would back off. That was it. Cass tapped the autopilot and jumped out of the seat, heading for the engineering control panels in the back. He disabled the safety systems without pause and dropped 2 of the magnetic locks, keeping the fuel stores away from each other. If the sensors on the Space Wings worked, they'd see he was minutes away from a massive explosion. The comms screamed at him again, but he ignored it, returning to the front of the ship. The fighters were backing off, keeping a safe distance. All he had to do was keep them off him long enough to get to the current and disappear inside. He turned back to the panel. With the locks down, he had maybe 2 minutes. Was the undercurrent close enough? He was already a good distance from Tempest. But where had they come out when they'd entered this system? He put the scanners to work, searching for the remnants of the old current. There, he said. Only it was too far away. He'd have to re-engage the fuel locks before he reached it. But if the fighters kept their distance... Cass adjusted the course to match the old current so he'd enter right where Tempest had come out. Checking the rear monitor, all 3 fighters were still there, hanging as close as they dared. It was a good bluff. People thought he was half suicidal as it was. This would just confirm everyone's prejudices. He ran back to the panel, counting down the seconds before he could re-engage the locks. He needed as much time as possible. 8, 7, 6, he counted to himself, his hands over the controls. 1 false move or 1 incorrect entry would mean his death. But performing under pressure had never been a problem for Cass, and it wouldn't be one now. 4, 3, 2, he said. At the same time, he re-engaged the locks and shunted the additional material back to the holding units. The alarm on the system quieted. Jumping up, Cass sprinted to the front and pushed the accelerator to its limit. The fighters were closing again. "Here we go," he yelled, initiating the undercurrent drive in the emitter at the exact spot Tempest had left. The undercurrent opened with ease, allowing the small ship into the tunnel and launching him millions of kilometers away from the fighters. Cass slumped back in his chair. Now for the hard part. 20. He didn't. He couldn't have. It wasn't possible. "Commander?" Greene's voice snapped Evie out of her thoughts, and she turned to him, his face burning. "Tell me you didn't know about this."
"He never would have left my sight if I had,"
she replied, just as angry. But she couldn't show her anger, not like the captain could. He had to be up to something. Caspian wouldn't betray them, not after everything he'd been through. She glanced over at Paige, who was doing a very bad job of keeping the smile off his face. He would never let this go now. Not after all of them watching that shuttle disappear into the undercurrent, despite her and the captain's repeated attempts to contact him. She didn't have a choice. There was only one way to settle this. "I tried to warn you," Paige said. "When I had to pull him off Isaac, I tried to tell everyone. Once a deserter, always a deserter. He was a security risk from the moment he stepped on this ship. He's probably on his way back to them now with a shuttle full of tactical information to sell to them. We might have all just been pawns in his game to defect to the Sill. You should have let me blow him out of the sky." Greene only shook his head.
"You're not that stupid, Joro, so don't pretend like you are," Evie said. "The fact was, Cass was ordered on this mission by Admiral Sangvi. He was coming whether anyone else wanted him to or not."
Paige's eyes flashed, but he returned to his duties.
"I don't believe he would defect," Saul said from Ops. "He was too insulted by—"
Evie cut him off with a hard stare.
"He is no longer a deserter."
Evie locked down her station and made her way to the hypervator doors.
"I'll get a shuttle prepped. And I want to bring some of the infantry soldiers with me, in case."
"Stay where you are, Commander," Greene ordered. She screwed up her face, planting her feet.
"You can't suggest we just let him go. I need to go after him. Tempest's engines won't be back online for another 2 hours, and he could be anywhere by then. If his trail degrades for more than a few minutes—"
"I'm aware," Greene said.
"May I see you in the command room for a moment?"
His voice sounded calm and measured. Too calm, considering what had just happened. They made their way to the command room, Evie taking another look at Paige and giving him the meanest scowl she could muster. Not only was it bad enough he'd been questioning her judgment ever since she'd been sent to retrieve Cass back in Sargan territory, but he'd made his concerns public to some of the other officers behind her back. And the last thing they needed was to lose confidence in their commanding officers. Had it not been against protocol, she would have decked him already. The doors closed behind them, and she was so focused on her anger at Paige, she didn't realize the captain still hadn't said anything. He only stood, looking out his small window at the stars and planetoids of the system beyond.
"I need to go after him, sir. Unless you're willing to write him off as a deserter."
"He is a deserter," Greene replied, clasping his hands behind his back.
"He abandoned the Coalition 5 years ago." "Because of a crime he didn't even commit."
"No, he committed it.
He disobeyed a direct order, regardless if it was the right thing to do or not. He still committed a high crime, and he had to pay the price when he returned to the Coalition. But instead of serving out his sentence like he was supposed to, he ran, abandoning the institution he'd sworn to protect."
Greene didn't move, only remained staring out the window.
"He was afraid Admiral Rutledge would do something else to him. Can you blame him for running?" she asked.
"Yes, I can," Greene replied. "Because serving the Coalition isn't just about living on starships and exploring the galaxy. It also means owning your mistakes, all of your mistakes, when you make them. Caspian made a mistake. Some could argue the bigger mistake was accepting a position from Admiral Rutledge in the first place. I looked it up. The terms of his parole were that he work on Axis Phi, performing menial tasks 6 hours a day, for 3 years. That was all he had to do, and he would have been free. Not exactly a hard job.
But Cass was grounded. He couldn't leave. He'd just exchanged a small prison for a large one. If you knew—
Greene turned and held up his hand.
"We all live in prisons of our own making. Do you think it was any better he became indebted to a Sargan overlord? He was still in prison." He paused. "No, if he'd finished out his time at the Axis 5 facility and been cleared, Then I would be more inclined to send you after him. But I'm not about to lose my XO because a civilian decided to desert. Sir, you can't seriously believe he's leaving for good. He's crucial to this mission. Maybe he's... Spare me the excuses, Diazol. You aren't responsible for defending Mr. Robeaux from the rest of us. Do I think he's stolen a shuttle and gone off to live on his own? No. From what I've seen of Caspian Robeaux, that seems very unlikely. But I can't ignore the fact he modified certain systems and injured a crew member in his attempt to do whatever it is he's doing. And based on his past behavior, there was a real possibility he's gone rogue. Evie clenched her hands. If she could just go after him, she was sure she could convince him to come back. So what do we do? He made it very clear he wanted to do whatever he's doing alone. And I'm not willing to sacrifice any of my crew to retrieve him. But I do want to know what he knew before he left. Something made him jump, and I need you to find out what it was. She pulled her lips between her teeth, concentrating. Sir? Wouldn't Lieutenant Paige... The lieutenant's objectivity has been compromised, Greene said. I couldn't trust his report unless I read it with my eyes closed. I realize you're on the other side of the coin, but I hope your objectivity hasn't been compromised. I would hate to find out you covered up evidence that supports a case of desertion. She stiffened. I'd never do that, sir. He nodded. I know. The chime of the door rang, indicating someone was outside the door. Enter, Greene said. The doors opened to reveal Chief Master Raffingtill, her helmet still in her hands. He faked a generator breach, Captain, she said, storming in. We had to back off. There was no telling if it was real or not. Raffingtill commanded the Space Wing fighters and had helped provide invaluable assistance during the encounter with Vina. Though Evie's only encounter with her had been when Evie had absconded with one of the Chief's ships to rescue Cass. From what she'd read of her record, Raffingtill was a brash woman, often charging head first into a situation rather than waiting for the go-ahead. It made her an effective tactician, if not something of a wild card. But she was good at her job. The fighters tended to keep to themselves and weren't technically crew members, as they each captained their own ships. But they did have duties on Tempest. It wasn't your fault, Chief. The fact you got out there as quickly as you did. Raffingtill winced. Her short blonde hair was plastered with sweat to her skull. I'm sorry I didn't wait for your orders, sir, but we couldn't let him take the shuttle like that. She turned to face Evie. You should have contained him. That's enough, Greene said. Get your ships in order, Chief. If we're going back into Sill space, we may need them. Though, he trailed off. Greene knew as well as anyone, short-range fighters wouldn't do a damn thing against the Sill ships. If a Dragon-class starship couldn't even hold her own, what were a series of smaller one-person fighters supposed to do? Don't worry, sir. We'll be ready with our teeth out. If you need us, we're prepared, she said. Thank you. Though I hope none of this is necessary. Diplomacy is still my highest priority. Raffingtill nodded, out of things to say. Dismissed, Greene added. She turned without another glance at Evie and left the two alone. How can we hope to go back in there without Cass? Evie asked when she was gone. Greene sighed, taking a seat at his desk. I'll talk to Laska. I don't see we have much choice, do you? I guess not. "21. Give me a diagnosis, Zach said, and be quick. Box examined the young woman lying in the bed before them. They'd brought her in from Bay 1, some sort of accident with the shuttle. Box hadn't heard the whole story, as the room had been a flurry of activity when the emergency unit brought her in. All he knew was it involved blunt force trauma. She's unconscious, Box said, leaning over her to examine her closer. She may have a cranial fracture from this bruising pattern, and her breathing is shallow, which is indicative of a head injury. She may not be getting enough oxygen to the brain. I agree, Zach said. Begin the full body scan. Let's make sure we're not dealing with something else here.
She waved Nurse Jimmy Minkle over to assist. Box glanced up at the monitor over the bed, watching as the scanner covered Crewman Zorus from head to toe. What happened? She was obviously struck, but unscheduled shuttle launch, Jimmy said. They said it was your friend. Box glanced over, taking his optics off the scanner. What friend? The traitor, Robeaux. He stole the shuttle? Box asked. That didn't make sense. He'd been so invested in making sure these negotiations went well. Jimmy shrugged. That's what they said.
None of that matters now, Zax interjected. Crewman Zorus could become critical at any minute. We need to take care of her before worrying about what's happening on the rest of the ship. Box, take note. The patient comes first, no matter what.
This should have focused Box, but he still couldn't comprehend Cass stealing a shuttle. He couldn't even pilot. Why hadn't he told Box about it? He could have helped. Though his time in sickbay had been pretty good so far, if Cass had asked, it would have meant giving up everything he'd built here. Scan complete, Jimmy said. Looks like you were right, Box. She's not getting enough oxygen to her brain. We need to halt the processes. Otherwise, she'll lose a good portion of her brain function.
Prep for surgery, Zax announced, moving over beside the crewman.
2 more nurses joined them as Box set a tray of standard tools beside Zax.
I'm going to open her up here and remove the broken cranial bone, she said, indicating with one of her arms. Go ahead and put her in temporary stasis.
Jimmy reached over to the bed and adjusted some controls.
Engaging stasis now.
A blue glow emanated from under Zorus, and the effect on the monitor was immediate. Her breathing all but stopped, and her pulse slowed to 2 beats per minute. All of her natural functions had been slowed. Zax picked up the incisor and made a cut around the bruised area of her skull, right above her left eye, peeling back the skin and discarding it. She then examined the fracture.
It's indented, all right, like a bulkhead. Box, give me the solution. Remove the affected bone, examine the brain for injury, and reconstruct the skull using calorsium growth to prevent rejection. Very good, Zax said, leaning down and not taking her eyes off Zorus. Humans were such fragile creatures, yet in other ways they were so resilient. Box found it fascinating. Zax took another tool, this one larger, and made an expert cut directly into the skull itself, taking great care to remove the broken bone. Beneath was Zorus's brain, but there was what looked like a blood clot in the center of the area they'd cut away. Regenerator. Zax held out her lower left hand. Box placed the regenerator in it, which was passed to the upper hand and held over the center of the clot. Here's hoping we don't lose anything important, she said. As Zax waved the device over the clot, it gradually disappeared until it was gone completely. Give me another scan. Jimmy tapped the button beside the bed, and the monitor scanned Zorus again. No indication of any more damage, Doc. Then let's regrow this bone and get this woman back on her feet, Zax said. She placed the tip of a tube to the edge of the cranium and pushed, a small amount of gooey liquid coming out. Box watched as the liquid shuddered slightly until it was the same color as Zorus's skull, then stretched to cover the affected area. It reminded him of a spider building a web. A strand would cross the center, then move around the circular opening and cross the center again, eventually making a tangled web covering the incision. Within a minute, it had been completely covered. Zax tapped it with an instrument. It's cured. She held up one last device, running it over the edges of the skin she'd cut away. It stimulated the edges of the skin, making them grow at an accelerated rate until they had recovered the affected area. After a few minutes, Box couldn't even tell there had ever been an injury. Deactivate the field, Zax said. They turned to Box. Here's the rough part. Don't hold your breath. Box stared at her, his eyes blinking. That was a joke. It helps to have humor in here.
Jimmy deactivated the field, and Zorus' breathing returned to normal. Zax watched the monitor closely.
Looks like everything is back within acceptable limits. Let's wake her.
Box leaned over with a mental stimulator and pressed it to the base of Zorus' neck, activating the device. Her eyes fluttered open, and she jerked.
Easy, Zax said, her arms up. It's okay, Crewman. Where?
She glanced around, agitated at first, but began to calm down quickly.
Doctor? How do you feel? Zax asked.
Zorus touched her head with her hand, feeling the area.
Okay, I think. What happened? You were in an accident. Nurse Mankel is going to take you to perform some mental tests to make sure everything is working correctly. Okay? She asked.
Zorus nodded, feeling her head again. Jimmy helped her up and off the bed. She wobbled for a moment, but gained her balance and followed him to another section of the sickbay.
Not bad, Zax said. You obviously don't have a problem retaining information, and you also seem to be applying it correctly.
She replaced all the tools back on the tray and moved it back into its sanitizing alcove.
I find it fascinating. Organic life is...
The doors to the sickbay opened, revealing Rond, a big grin on his face.
Lieutenant, Zax said, is there something we can do for you?
I just need to take him, Rond said. Box glanced between them.
Why?
He asked, accusation creeping into his voice. There was no reason not to be suspicious after what Rond had already tried to pull. And though he hadn't attempted anything since that day, Box had the distinct feeling Rond was just waiting for another opportunity. Captain has ordered the machine confined to quarters, he replied, his grin even wider.
Why?
Zax asked. Rond took a few steps forward.
His partner in crime stole a shuttle and took off to who knows where. The captain feels this machine could be a liability, or even some kind of infiltration unit. And until more information is known, he's to be confined.
This is ridiculous, Zax said. They continued arguing, but Box had quit paying attention. All his focus was on picking up Rond and tossing him across the room like a doll. They thought he was a traitor? The concept was ludicrous. As if they could stop him. And now that he'd found something he truly loved, the captain was going to take that away from him, too? Doesn't matter. For the security of the ship, he's coming with me, Rond was saying.
Where is Lieutenant Paige? He's the head of security. Why isn't he here? Zax asked.
He's occupied with other matters regarding the traitor's departure. He asked if I would be willing to help him with this. Zax crossed two of her arms.
And he doesn't have any other security personnel who could do this for him?
Rond shrugged.
We're dead in the water at the moment. I had some time to spare.
Zax made a sound of disgust in her throat and raised one of her arms, activating her comm.
Captain? This is sickbay. I need to confirm you've ordered Box confined to quarters. Confirmed, sickbay. We can't take any chances at the moment. Not until we know what's going on, Greene's voice replied.
Ron turned back to Box, his smile wider than ever.
Are you going to be a problem? Or can we be civil about this? I can have a contingent of guards here in 20 seconds. Afraid I'll break your spine? Box asked, seething, but unable to show it. I know which vertebrae I'd need to shatter to rob you of your legs. Or your ability to pee.
He leaned closer to Rond, whose smile faltered for the first time.
Want to test my knowledge? Box, Zax said from behind him. I'm sorry, but this is Captain's orders. I'm sure it's only temporary, and you'll be back here shortly.
Rond looked more triumphant than ever. He stuck his arm out toward the door.
After you,
he said. Box took one last look at the sickbay. All of the nurses and Zax staring at the scene before them. Even Zorus had turned from her chair. He wanted to smash something, or at least yell at the man wearing the shit-eating grin. But what choice did he have? Any outburst would be read as confirmation of their fears, and without Cass, he'd be taken down to one of the science labs and disassembled. It was a good thing they couldn't see his fear. He walked ahead of Rond out of sickbay without another word, accompanying him in the hallway where 3 other security guards waited for them. He didn't even look back at Rond. The man was just waiting for any excuse to bait or taunt him, and Box wouldn't give it to him. If Box couldn't do the work he enjoyed, he needed to figure out what had happened to Cass, and why. And maybe that would keep him busy enough not to think about the humiliation he just suffered. "22. This was how he should have done it the first time. No Tempest, no Captain Greene, no other people to get in his way or try to help him. The Coalition should have sent him in here alone. Cass regretted leaving Box behind, but bringing him along only would have made them both targets, and he was doing much better on Tempest by himself. Cass chuckled. Box still thought he didn't know he was going down to sickbay every day. Frustrated with Laska last week, Cass had come back early to find Box returning to the room ahead of him. The next morning, he tracked Box's movements using the computer, and every morning since. It was always the same thing. He'd leave 15 minutes after Cass left for the day, spend it in sickbay, then return 15 minutes before Cass was due to end his bridge shift, where he'd arrange himself in the exact same position as he was in when Cass had left, to give the illusion he hadn't moved all day. He considered calling Box out on it a few times, but decided his friend would tell him when he was ready. Cass was glad whatever he was doing down there seemed to be working out for him. Had there been a problem, there was no question he would have heard about it by now. Pulling him out of that to get his help to steal the shuttle wasn't what was best for Box, and Cass could only hope he'd understand in the end. And Evie would take care of him, or at least she better. Cass put his chances at returning somewhere around 20 to 25%, and if he didn't come back, they better not take it out on his partner. He took a breath and stood up, stretching. The shuttle wasn't spacious, but it wasn't cramped either. Enough to walk around and stave off stiffness. A fair sight better than those Space Wing fighters. But then again, people weren't expected to spend hours upon hours in those at a time. His journey back to Sill space would take at least twice as long, due to the limited nature of the shuttle's undercurrent drive. He couldn't help but crack a smile. A Klaxian wouldn't even fit in here. He accessed the rear sensor panel to check on the breach from the Space Wing, finding it not as serious as he'd first thought. Calypso should have no trouble getting him where he needed to go. Cass returned to his seat, searching the shuttle's database for anything interesting. He'd been quite proud of himself for outmaneuvering those fighters back there. Having barely piloted anything, it was comforting with how easy the controls responded. But a Coalition ship was designed to be easy and comfortable. Back on the reasonable excuse, if he'd wanted to hit the throttle and brake right at the same time, he either needed very long arms or 2 people manning the controls. Perhaps he wasn't as bad of a pilot as he thought. Cass leaned back in his seat, watching the stars pulse by as the walls of the undercurrent enveloped the ship like a protective cocoon. It was so deceiving that way. If even one of his stabilizing emitters failed, the wall of the undercurrent could collapse, crushing him at any moment. It had been a minor miracle Tempest hadn't suffered more damage when the Sill ship knocked them out of the undercurrent. Somehow that ship had come up behind them with little warning, like they'd known exactly where they would be. That was a trick Cass wouldn't mind learning. Maybe they'll honor a last request, he said to himself as he laid his head back and closed his eyes. Sleep came quick. He was awoken by a warning klaxon, followed by the shuttle lurching to one side, throwing him from the seat. Damn seatbelt, he mumbled, pushing himself up and onto his knees. He was still in the undercurrent. Somehow the blast hadn't knocked him out. The scanner showed a large Sill ship behind him, just like what had happened on Tempest. Cass disengaged the drive, returning to normal space, and upon checking the maps, realized he was right at the edge of their territory. The large Sill ship exited after him, continuing to take shots at him, but never hitting the shuttle. They seemed to be nothing more than warning shots. but he couldn't take that chance. He tried making some maneuvers Box had showed him, but the shuttle was slow to respond. And despite the controls being easy to use, the ship just wasn't doing what he wanted it to. Cass hit the comm, trying to send a broadband message, but he didn't get a confirmation of anyone receiving. "Pointless not to try anyway," he said to himself before clearing his throat. "My name is Caspian Robeaux, and I'm here representing the Coalition. But I am not part of the Coalition. I was the person who sent the distress call 7 years ago, which resulted in your ship being saved." The blast around him stopped at once. Wow. That was easy. The ship jerked forward, and Cass realized something had penetrated the hull. He tapped a few of the sensor cameras, trying to get a good look at it, when the ship jerked again. They'd hooked onto him somehow, and despite the thrust of his engines, he couldn't pull away. He got a camera on the outside of the ship. 2 long cables ran from the Sill ship to his hull, where they had embedded themselves deep into the bulkheads with spikes. Cass couldn't say he was surprised. He'd hoped to at least begin negotiations on the shuttle, but there was no guarantee the Sill would work that way, and here was the proof. They would bring him in to interrogate him, and that would be all she wrote. He hoped he'd be able to convince them of the impending threat before they sliced his head off. He just had to keep telling himself this was what he wanted. This was the only way. Panic seized his chest. What the hell was he doing? Sacrificing himself for the Coalition? That hadn't been part of the plan. Somehow, over the past couple of weeks, Laska had wormed her way inside his head, made him think the Coalition was all that mattered. Had she brainwashed him? He couldn't be certain, but something was definitely wrong. This wasn't how he was going to die. Grabbing the controls of the shuttle, Cass turned it to face the way he was being pulled and hit the accelerator. The shuttle shot forward, and the cables pulling him went slack until he jerked the ship up, attempting to wrap the cables around the nose of the Sill ship, hoping perhaps they'd snap. The shuttle jerked again, and Cass realized they'd embedded a 3rd cable and could now hold him in a steady position as they pulled him in. Cass hit the controls with his hands as they flashed off and back on again, sending out an error message. He turned to the front window of the shuttle. He could at least get an idea of what he was going into here. The Sill ship was sleek and black, like a series of knives held together by the handles. Exactly like he remembered from 7 years ago. He wiped the sweat forming on his brow and took a breath. On the side of the ship, he saw the same familiar purple symbol he'd seen in the video feeds. Just as expected. Whoever was on this ship, they were obviously the designated Border Patrol, tasked with taking care of any errant Coalition units coming across their borders. Cass had to admit they had been fast to stop him. Tempest was lucky to get out of here. If he hadn't sent that comm, would they still have spared him? They didn't seem interested in destroying him as he skirted their border, only scaring him off. Otherwise, they could have plowed one of their missiles directly into the side of the shuttle. So, what did they want? To extract information? The shuttle was pulled into a hangar not much larger than the shuttle itself. As soon as it was inside, the hangar door closed, sending the room into pitch black. The only lights were those inside the shuttle. Cass tried looking out through the windows, but could see nothing. The only thing he could tell was the Sill did use artificial gravity, because the shuttle was parked on something solid and wasn't drifting in any direction. Either that, or those cables they'd used to pull him in were stronger than they looked. The side doors to the shuttle opened without warning, causing Cass to jump back, pressing himself up against the main console. A figure stepped in, though it was unlike anything Cass had ever seen before. It was a bipedal creature, that much was clear. But as far as Cass could tell, it had no face. It had a head, but where the face should be were only what looked like carvings or runes on a stone. As he looked further, the carvings were all over the creature, whose monocolor body didn't seem to have a seam or break anywhere. Could this be the natural form of the Sill? Above the creature's head was a small crystal, or perhaps power source, that glowed purple. It wasn't bright, though it did seem to pulse every few seconds. And it seemed to be suspended directly in front of the creature's forehead, not actually touching anything. The creature reached out, and Cass noticed it had 5 fingers on the end of its long hand, which he found oddly comforting. Behind the creature, some kind of molded cape came down the back and wrapped back up in the front, becoming part of the full body. The cape reminded Cass of insect wings. Unmoving, the creature held its hand out to Cass, as if to beckon him forward. He wasn't sure how to react. "My name is Caspian Robeaux." He stopped talking with the purple glowy thing of the creature's head pulsed in rhythm with his words. Was that how they heard? But how could they see? Unlike the Klaxians, who were completely blind, but had a large number of appendages and feelers, this creature appeared to be not that different than any of the other bipedal races. The only difference was the distinct lack of a face. Can you even understand me?" The figure, roughly 2 meters tall, stepped forward and grabbed Cass by the shoulder. Pain surged through the connection point, as well as the strange sensation of something absorbing into him. "I understand you fine, you trash. Now come with me, or suffer dismemberment," a voice said. Cass glanced around, not sure of the source of the voice. It was as if it had come to him in his mind, but he definitely heard it as well. It had to be the creature. There was no one else around. "I'm here for formal negotiations," Cass said. "I need to inform your people of a threat." "Be quiet," the voice warned, louder now. Cass stared at the creature, who hadn't moved other than putting its hand on him. He needed to do something. "I'm not in the coalition anymore. I only represent them," he said. "Final warning," the creature said. Cass dropped his head and put his hands up, relenting. He couldn't talk if he was dead, and the only way any of this would be worth it was if he made them understand before they killed him. That familiar panic shot through him again. Had this been worth it? Why had he run off half-cocked on some suicide mission? Laska must have done something to him, inserted some kind of programming in him. If he made it back, he'd see that she and everyone she worked for would face the same consequences as Rutledge. But now he needed to focus on staying alive. Cass stepped out of the shuttle into the darkness. The only light in the room came from ahead of him, where 2 more purple energies glowed. As he grew closer, his hands stretched out in front of him to keep him from smacking into the ground should he trip on anything. He realized the light sources belonged to 2 more Sill, flanking a doorway. Both these Sill looked different from the one who had come to retrieve him. They seemed to be made out of the same material, but it flowed and moved in different ways, neither of them with the insect wings on the back. And both of their head auras were slightly different as well, the energy patterns moving in different sequences and held by a different shape. They were mesmerizing in their own way. One turned before he arrived and walked ahead of them through the corridor beyond. The second waited until Cass had passed and fell into line behind them. It was so dark, Cass could barely make out any details at all, but they were in some kind of hallway. He could see the walls and the floor, but not the ceiling. Either the Sill also breathed oxygen, or they'd created this environment for him. He couldn't be sure. At some point, the corridor curved to the right, and Cass continued to follow the lead Sill. There was something very strange about this place. It felt different than where he'd parked the shuttle. It was as if when he'd passed through into the corridor, everything changed, but he couldn't tell how. Their footsteps were so quiet, it was almost silent, and the air was devoid of any smell. It was as if it had been purified so it contained as few particles as possible. The corridor slanted up, causing him to work harder to get up the hill, though it didn't slow down the Sill at all. Finally, they came to a door which they passed through into a long room. Despite its apparent size, as it was still dark as space, it felt claustrophobic. The Sill in front of him turned around, placing its hands with their long fingers on him. Cass glanced at both hands. "What?"
"Quiet,"
a different voice said. The figure in front of him pushed him back to the wall, holding him there for a moment. As soon as the figure let go, Cass attempted to relax, only to find his body immobilized. "Hey, I can't move." It felt like his body was made of stone. His internal processes still working, but everything below his neck had frozen.
"Wait here,"
the voice said. The three Sill turned in unison and filed back through the doorway. "Wait! I need to speak with a representative. I have urgent information I need to relay." But they were already gone. "Perfect," Cass said, now enveloped in complete darkness. "Just perfect." 23. Cass couldn't tell how long the darkness enveloped him. He felt as if he was drifting into an infinite abyss. At one point, he began to even question if he was on a ship at all. Perhaps he had died in the attack, and this was whatever the afterlife was supposed to be. If he were alive, shouldn't he at least be able to hear the hum of an engine or the movement of plasma through a conduit? There was nothing. He'd close his eyes and open them again, hoping each time the nightmare would be over, but to no avail. His appendages became sore, then tingled, then went numb. And at one point, he needed to pee and had absolutely no way to mitigate the mounting pressure. All he could do was grit his teeth and bear down, praying to core he didn't piss his pants on the first diplomatic contact between the Coalition and the Sill. When he wouldn't be able to hold it any longer, a pinpoint of purple light appeared to his right. The longer he stared at it, the more he thought he was hallucinating. But no, it was really there, and growing closer. Finally, he saw the form the light belonged to. Another Sill, though this one was bigger than the other three, by an order of magnitude. It was at least twice as wide, and almost another half-meter tall. And its purple head aura was more intense than the others. It glowed with a subtle brightness that hadn't been present with the other Sill. Cass could only assume this was the captain, owner, diplomat. It was impossible to tell. The Sill touched him on his shoulder.
"You're a human?"
the voice asked. It was husky in a way, but with an undercurrent of empathy. Was it empathy? He couldn't be sure. But there was something under there, something he didn't understand yet. But it sounded as if this person might be female, if the Sill even had genders. Cass nodded.
"You have a buildup of waste,"
the Sill said. Cass, embarrassed, tried to remember which of Laska's classes covered normal bodily functions and how to deal with them in diplomatic contact. But only a moment after the voice had said it, the pressure was gone. Cass tried to look down to see if he had let it go all over the place, only for the voice to return.
"It's been taken care of. Why are you here?" it asked.
"It's been taken care of? What did they do? Suck it out of my body?" Now was his chance. "I'm here representing the sovereign
"You said you weren't part of the Coalition," the voice said.
Cass felt as if the faceless creature was boring into his mind. All that were present were the runes on its face, but Cass could almost feel it looking at him. He really wished he could see something else in the room. It would give him something else to focus on, other than this strange person. "I'm the representative. I was arrested and imprisoned after I helped save your ship." The figure swayed.
"You saved nothing. That ship was captured."
Damn it. They did know about the Atlas's success in retrieving their ship. Rutledge's arrogance was going to cost him his life. No sense in pretending he wasn't aware of it. Cass narrowed his eyes. He couldn't worry about Rutledge's actions now. This might be his only chance. I've come to warn you of a threat.
There is no threat the Coalition could dream up that we wouldn't be prepared for.
This isn't the Coalition. Their telescopes have detected—
Your story is already false, the voice interrupted. The evidence says you are an appointed agent of the Coalition. I don't even know if you are the person who made that distress call 7 years ago. This is nothing more than a bluff, an elaborate attempt to infiltrate our borders.
It's not a bluff, Cass protested. I'm telling the truth. There really is a threat, and it's unlike—
Present your evidence, the Sill said.
His heart sank. He'd been so stunned by the creature coming to collect him, he'd forgotten the data on the shuttle. I have sensor logs on my ship. They can confirm—
Your information has been examined, and no threat was present. Do you wish to advance any other evidence?
The logs weren't there? How could that be? He'd made certain to bring the information with him, knowing the Sill would want proof. He'd specifically downloaded everything before leaving. He remembered doing it.
Lack of further evidence only confirms our position. You are charged with the death of 10 Sill civilians and will face the appropriate trial and punishment.
The Sill turned to leave. Wait! Cass tried moving to stop the Sill, only to find his head immobilized now as well. He only had his mouth to work with. The Sill turned slightly. Wait. What is your name?
Zenfore, Consul of Ranglass, this ship.
Consul? Is that like a captain? Cass asked. Never mind. Consul Zenfore, please, listen to me. I would not have violated your borders by myself without a good reason. What logical goal could I have by coming here alone?
Without evidence to the contrary, your words mean little, Zenfore said.
I'm telling you, the evidence you need is in the shuttle. The information has been downloaded on the ship's computer. I have astrometric data, images, video, everything you would need to show that I am telling the truth. What could have happened to that data? Could they be bluffing? The problem was, he knew next to nothing about these people, though from his short experience with Zenfore, they seemed to have a reliance on evidence. Or at least a strong inclination. Was that how their society was structured? Or was it this particular Sill? He needed more information and more exposure to them to understand.
Your shuttle has been searched. Must I tell you again, the data does not exist.
That isn't possible. She must be lying in order to give them a reason to fight him. The data was there, he was sure of it. But for some reason she wanted to pretend like it wasn't. Then you tell me, why am I here? Cass spat. Why risk myself in a shuttle that is obviously inferior?
It does not matter. You have been restrained and will be dealt with in short order.
Why go to all the trouble of capturing me if you were never going to listen in the first place? He asked, struggling against the restraint.
Your crimes require a trial to which you will be subjected.
Crimes? Was crossing their border such an unreasonable offense? They went to this much trouble for everyone?
No wonder your species is so inferior. You do not listen. Your crimes are the deaths of the 10 civilians. Prepare to be charged, Zenfore said.
I had nothing to do with that, Cass protested. I was the one who tried to save them. By the time the ship was captured, I was running for my life from the Coalition. They betrayed me. The imposing figure stood before him for a moment.
This makes no sense. They betrayed you, and yet you claim to represent them? Present your evidence.
I don't have any evidence, Cass yelled. I did it for the benefit of all the innocent people who could be killed by this thing coming straight at us. And it's not going to stop with the Coalition. Zenfore shifted in front of him, her long arm raising up and landing on his shoulder.
You will have another opportunity to present your evidence at trial, Zenfore said. We won't meet again.
She dropped her arm and left him in the darkness, with only his thoughts as 24.
Did you take care of it?
Paige asked as Isaac Ron strolled up to him in the corridor. He kept his voice low, even though the corridor was empty.
Yeah. I thought for a minute he might put up a fight. But unfortunately, he went quietly,
Isaac said, rubbing his hands in his pants as he approached.
Got stupid lubricant all over my hands.
You're not trying hard enough, Paige replied.
Hey, I got him to punch a wall before, and I reported it to the Admiral, and it didn't do jack shit. They're both still here.
Paige smirked. One of them is still here. My job is done. The other one, he's your department. Isaac sneered at him.
Just because you got lucky and yours decided to jump ship doesn't mean your job is done. I need help with mine. He's got some kind of weird Zen thing going on now. I can barely get a rise out of him.
Paige sighed and pushed off the wall, taking a few steps down the hall. Isaac caught up with him.
Maybe it won't matter anymore. With the traitor gone and the machine locked in his room, this might be the best situation we could hope for. I already know the captain's faith in the traitor is shaky, no matter what our first officer says. He wouldn't have authorized my request to have the robot confined otherwise.
What do you think Cass went off to do? Face them alone? Isaac asked. Paige shook his head.
No way. He ran. Just like he ran when they put him on parole. He's probably headed back to Sargon space, though it will take him a season to get there, if he's even got that many supplies. I overheard one of the Space Wing guys talking about how he faked a shuttle breach to get them to back off.
So what? Paige spat. Are you impressed? Any rookie could have done that. Though it would be a delicate bit of work to keep the ship from igniting and reallocating the matter back into their holding pods. Paige hated to admit it, but maybe Cass wasn't all talk after all. Why do you have it in for him so badly anyway? I get he's a deserter, but as far as I can tell, he's a competent officer. Well, not officer, but former officer, Isaac said. Paige could feel himself darkening. The Sargon Commonwealth isn't just some jumble of coalition reject humans. They are a well-organized superpower controlled by a massive crime syndicate. Why anyone would ever want to live there is beyond me. But all that power comes with consequences, especially when they run into people who don't agree with them. By the time I was your age, I had spent 15 years defending my home against border skirmishes from people who wanted to rob, rape, and kill me and my family. My home, my friends, we were all part of the planetary resistance, fighting off the Sargans every time they landed looking for supplies, fuel, or parts. You don't know what they're like. I watched a Sargan ship bombard an entire city from orbit because the city refused to allow the ship to land and take refuge from a skirmish with the Coalition. Sometimes they would try to sneak in during the night, take our fuel supplies. I learned to sleep with a weapon in my hands at all times. One night, I woke to my mother's screams as a group tried to kidnap her along with all our food. My father killed 3 of them that night. I killed the 4th.
Fuck,
Isaac said. Paige turned to him. When we encountered them back outside Karpur, was that the first time you'd ever faced Sargans? Isaac nodded. Then yeah. You just don't get it. Out there on the frontier, where coalition support is weak or non-existent, the Sargans will do anything they can to gain a foothold. I grew up knowing nothing else.
You're from Meridian, right?
He asked. Meridian 3, Paige replied.
That's technically not even in Coalition space. No wonder you were under attack constantly.
I've been defending what's mine since I could pick up a knife, Paige said, pushing the memories away. He couldn't relive those right now, though they were threatening to break through anyway. And I'm not about to let some Sargan scum come on this ship and pretend like everything is okay. You heard him. He worked for them. A former Coalition officer. Isaac shrugged. I'm just saying, whatever he was doing with that shuttle, he was determined to do it or die trying. I'm not sure that sounds like someone who is running away. Isaac wiped his hands in his pants again. I should get that machine disassembled for this, he mumbled. Paige needed to calm down, or he was going to have another attack right here in the hallway. The drugs only did so much, and the last thing he needed was another reprimand on his record. He needed to focus on something else, something other than bad memories. What had the kids said? Disassembled? Maybe that can be arranged, Paige replied, focusing his mind. How did that happen? He pointed to Isaac's hands. Oh, I was escorting him back to his quarters with those security officers you sent, and as soon as he got inside the door, some port opened on his side, and I got lubrication all over my hands. Then he made some kind of chuckling sound and a half-hearted apology. Paige furrowed his brow. So, would you say he malfunctioned in front of you? I wouldn't call it a malfunction, Isaac said. It was pretty obvious he was doing it intentionally. But could you call it a malfunction? Yeah, I guess so, Isaac replied. A young ensign jogged past them. Paige avoided eye contact, even as the ensign acknowledged them. And my security guys, they saw it too? It was hard to miss, Isaac said, still wiping his hands. Whatever this stuff is, it isn't coming off. I might have to go to sickbay to get them to remove it. Listen, as soon as you're done with that, file an official complaint to Droid Control. Tell them the new bot on board isn't working quite right. We might be able to get around the brass. He rubbed his chin. Do you think they'll pay attention? We are in the middle of an emergency at the moment. Yeah, I know. But maybe DC is having a slow day. Either way, it can't hurt. He narrowed his eyes. Oh, I hope he does come back. Can you imagine the look on his face when he realizes his friend isn't about 1,000,000 pieces down in one of the repair bays? He'll never want to step on the ship again. Or he'll kill me for putting him down there, he said. Let me worry about that, Paige replied, imagining Cass's shocked face when he came back aboard. Don't you think that's kind of extreme? Isaac asked. Getting them kicked off the ship is one thing, but having the robot disassembled? Isn't that... Paige spun on him. What? Harsh? Cruel? Did you already forget about Blackburn? The girl you told me you planned a date as soon as you got the courage to ask her out? If not for that scum and his robot, you two might be strolling hand in hand right now. Paige was pushing too far, but he'd run out of options. If the robot wasn't going to make a scene or cause any danger, there had to be another way to get rid of him. And often the simplest answers were the best. Get the diagnostics teams on him. They'd have to take him halfway apart to figure out what's going on inside there, and by then, it will be too late. And even if they did get him back together, he might not wake up the same machine he was when he went down. They might even be able to reprogram him to better serve the ship. Isaac's face had gone red, but he wasn't saying anything, only staring Paige down. Perfect. You're a bastard, he finally whispered. I know. It takes a bastard to do my job. My number one concern has always been this ship, and I won't let these two disrupt what we have here. I will do anything to protect this ship. He resumed his path down the hallway. Anything. 25. Evie approached the doors to engineering, still debating how to handle this. She didn't want to come off as an interrogator, but she didn't want to go soft on them either. The ship's internal sensors registered engineering as the last place Cass had been before taking off for Bay 1 of the shuttle. If she was going to find anything, it would be in here. Her comm chirped. Commander? Box? What's wrong? She asked. Did you know? He asked. Know what? About the captain's decision to contain me to quarters. She stopped in her tracks. No. He never said anything to me about it. They confined you? As of 20 minutes ago, he said. She caught the hint of not only anger, but sadness in his voice. Did the captain really think he was a risk without Cass here? I'm sorry, Box. Let me investigate this, and I'll call you back. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation.
And if there's not, I'll talk to the captain. But I'm sorry. I'll call you back soon. I'm on an assignment, she said.
He didn't protest any further, so she cut the comm. There would be no need for this assignment had Cass talked to her before going off half-cocked. Whatever he planned, it had to be something bad, something he didn't want to risk anyone else stopping him over, which made her job much harder because he probably didn't tell anyone. Between him and the robot, Evie might soon find herself at the ship's bar if she wasn't careful. But to be honest, she was glad she was the one investigating. She didn't trust anyone else to do it. Greene was right. Everyone had their own prejudices and concerns, and none of them could be trusted.
Commander,
Ensign Yamashita said, passing her in the hall. Evie caught a glint in her eye, and a smile wider than most of the rest of the crew offered her as Yamashita passed. Evie turned, watching her as he made her way down the hall, and couldn't help her eyes from drifting downward. No. The last thing she needed to do was get involved with a junior officer. Not only would that make things complex aboard the ship, it would give Paige an unending stream of comments to hurl at her behind her back, and she already knew she was on his shit list. It was obvious he was gunning for her job, but as long as his temper kept getting the better of him, it was unlikely he'd ever leave tactical. Unless he was reassigned altogether. Evie smiled at the prospect. Ensign Yamashita turned to look back at her, her own smile growing larger in response. Evie whipped her head back around and cursed herself. She'd have to take the ensign aside later, explain nothing could ever happen between them. Though Yamashita had proved herself more than capable on the weapons of Cass's old ship, maybe Yamashita could be the new tactical officer once Paige had been kicked off. That thought made her smile even more. She needed to focus. Depending on what Cass knew before he left could potentially influence how the captain was willing to react. Stepping forward, the doors opened for her, revealing engineering. Most of the main conduits had been repaired, and the crews seemed to be winding down, prepping to start everything back up again. Sester stood in the middle of the room, his appendages on 2 consoles at once, reprogramming the input parameters for the new engines.
Commander Diazol,
Ensign Tyler said, approaching.
I wasn't aware you would be supervising.
He sounded strange, worried even.
I'm not,
she replied.
I'm here to check on your status, and I wanted to see it for myself. When can we be back up and running?
Tyler turned so he was staring in the same direction she was.
Another hour, I think. Sester says he can get it done quicker, but I believe in being cautious.
As if on cue, one of Sester's appendages turned to look at Evie. She hadn't been around many Klaxians, but always found them an interesting species. No optical nerves at all, and yet they saw better than most humans. Either with their appendages and how their tactile touch created an image in their minds, or their otherworldly perception of things. She often wondered if Sester could sense everyone on the ship at once.
Not everyone. Only those within a certain radius of myself.
The words were like a bucket of cold water running down her back, and she shivered.
Did he talk to you?
Tyler smirked.
I used to have the same look on my face whenever he would speak to me. You get used to it.
She shook it off.
It's fine. An hour, you say? I'll report it back to the captain.
She surveyed the room as the crews continued to work.
Is there something else, Commander?
Tyler asked.
Yes. Did you or anyone else in here have contact with Robeaux before he left?
The air in the room stilled. At first, Evie thought it was just her, until she noticed the work crews glancing up and taking notice as well, as if they'd all felt the same thing at once.
He was here,
Tyler said, seemingly the only one unaffected by the strange sensation she felt.
But not for long. He worked on that terminal over there for a while. Ironically, he said he was here to do an inspection for the bridge, too.
Tyler eyed her with a renewed curiosity.
Relax, Ensign. I'm not going to run off with another shuttle. But I do need to know what he was looking for.
The temperature in the room seemed to drop a couple of degrees, and Evie rubbed her arms at the chill.
Is there a problem with the environmental units in here? Not as far as I know.
Tyler led her over to the terminal.
Do you know what he was doing over here?
I couldn't tell exactly, but it seemed to me he was looking into something he shouldn't have been. Tyler opened the station. The screen glowed to life immediately.
Why do you say that? She asked.
Just a feeling, Tyler replied.
I was watching him over my shoulder, and it seemed he was working hard on something, but every time I asked him if I could help, he said he'd take care of it. I'm not one of those people who necessarily blames Mr. Robeaux for what happened to him, especially not after all the help he gave us down here. But still, it seemed wrong to me. And then I find out he leaves from here and steals a shuttle. I have to think I made the right call.
And what call is that? Evie asked, scanning the screen. Nothing was showing up.
What did he access? I wiped the files he tried to transfer to the shuttle, Tyler said.
She turned to him.
You what?
He took a step back, his face flushing.
I erased the files. He left here in a hurry, and I tracked him. And once he was in the shuttle bay, I knew what he was doing. So I went back into the system, and sure enough, he'd sent a packet of files to the shuttle. I just deleted them. I figured if it was a sanctioned order, then he had no business having those files, right?
Her ears grew hot.
Did you see any of the data?
He shook his head.
No, but I'm sure there's a backup copy in Tempest's computer.
If Cass had done what she suspected him of doing, then he would have taken the proof of the alien threat with him. But if Tyler deleted the files, he wouldn't have anything for the Sill.
Damn it, Cass. This is why you don't go off to take care of shit on your own.
I need to see what he was looking at, she replied.
I don't have that clearance, Tyler replied. You'll have to talk to the commander.
He indicated Sester. Evie wasn't sure, but she thought she saw one of his appendages flinch as soon as Tyler mentioned him.
Commander, could I have access to the files Cass was viewing, please? She asked.
He turned from the consoles, facing her in a way that only a Klaxian could.
I tried to warn him not to access them. He wouldn't listen. That's okay, she replied. Just let me see what he was looking for.
Sester made his way across the room, his massive frame moving with the grace of a bird. He ducked down to fit under the catwalk, stretching and contorting himself so he could stand beside them.
He needed information from your personal logs, Commander. I apologize. I didn't grant him access, but I didn't actively try to stop him either.
Her face softened.
Why not? Because his intentions were correct, even if his methods were not.
He knew. Sester had seen something in Cass and knew of the threat. It was always hard to tell how much Klaxians could read from certain people. She glanced at Tyler. He wasn't being given the same courtesy of hearing Sester as she was. He seemed bewildered by the conversation.
Can you show me?
The terminal beside her automatically activated, showing her own personal files. Sester highlighted the path Cass took and the files he copied. They were image and video files she had taken from the Atlas, files she backed up before giving them over to the Coalition.
Was this all?
Sester led her down another path, this one showing the visual logs they'd recorded in their brief skirmish with the Sill. He'd copied files from both. He then showed her how Cass had copied the surveillance data from the unknown threat, presumably to show the Sill. He'd gone to try and convince them on his own, and he'd probably gotten himself killed in the process. Why did he have to be so hard-headed? He'd flushed up her neck into her face, and she had to work to keep her temper in check.
"Ensign,"
she said,
"you're temporarily relieved from duty."
"What?" Tyler said, stepping back.
"You should have reported this data to the bridge immediately. Instead, you saw fit to make the decision to delete it and tell no one."
But he was... There was no time.
If I'd waited, he would have escaped with the information, yes, which he was cleared to do. Now, we potentially have a man of the field with no backup and no bargaining chips. You should have informed your bridge officer immediately. She turned to Sester. The same goes for you. I was unaware of the data transfer. After he had what he needed, I stopped listening. Convenient, she said. and it isn't as if I can relieve you, since you are necessary for the engines to work. But be assured, the captain will hear of this." She turned back to Tyler. "Did I make myself clear?"
"Yes, Commander," he said, stiffening. He made an about face and exited engineering. Sester extricated himself from under the catwalk and stood his full 4 meters in height.
"I know you didn't mean any harm, but we should have known. We could have done something," she said. "You would have stopped him, which was exactly what he didn't want. He didn't want any more crew members to die for him. He's lost enough because of his decisions."
Evie winced, thinking about the lost souls on the Atlas. First, because of his actions of alerting the Sill to their presence, then, after they tried to activate an untested weapon, resulting in the loss of all hands. There was no way Cass didn't feel that burden. No wonder he'd been so mopey on the way here. But that didn't mean he could make up the rules as he went along. There was a chain of command on this ship, and everyone had to follow it. No exceptions.
"That wasn't his call to make, Commander," she said. "And it wasn't yours either."
With that, she left engineering, dreading her next meeting with the captain. 26. This darkness would drive him mad. How did an entire species operate without any sources of light? Perhaps since they didn't seem to have any kind of eyes, they didn't need light. But they had to be able to see somehow. Zenfore had turned to him to interrogate him. That meant she looked at him. Maybe it was like the Klaxians' ability. Perhaps they developed along a similar evolutionary curve, though the physical structure of his Sill was much closer to a human than he would have suspected. Coming aboard, he'd had no clue what to expect. They could have been beings made out of pure energy, or amphibious creatures with their ship full of liquid. Or they could have been completely incomprehensible to him in every way, and he would have stepped onto the ship finding it empty. Creatures who lived on more than one plane of existence at once. But no. They seemed to emulate the same body structure of many of the common species. 2 legs, 2 arms, head, hands. But there was also something very odd about them, and it had to do with that aura that surrounded their heads. Cass couldn't help but wonder if it was connected to the ship in any way. So far, every Sill had varying colors of purple auras, and that just happened to be the same color of the symbol he saw on the outside of the ship. Could they be connected? Were the auras not part of the Sill themselves, but instead an enhancement of some kind? Or maybe even an insignia or rank for serving on the ship. Even if he'd spent decades under the tutelage of Laska, he couldn't have hoped to have been prepared for this. No one could. Diplomacy would only come with further contact, and it would be impossible as long as he was stuck here against this wall. Zenfore had said something about a trial. He hoped it would be like the trials he'd seen on other worlds, where the accused was allowed to speak. Cass needed to make his case before whoever was running the trial before he was executed, which meant he needed proof. But without the data, all they would have would be his word. He needed some other way in which to convince them he wasn't the enemy here. He shuddered to think what would happen if Tempest tried to enter Sill space again, especially now that they had him as a captive. Though to their credit, they didn't seem interested in using him as bait or as ransom. They simply wanted to kill him for something he didn't do. Cass struggled, tried to move anything that would move, but finding it impossible. Even his head had gone immobile after Zenfore left, which allowed him to breathe and little else. He had to admit it was an effective way of keeping your prisoners from causing trouble. And since they were planning on killing him anyway, what difference did it make that his arms and legs had long lost all their feeling? He could have a blood clot at any moment, leading to an aneurysm, and Zenfore would come back to find him dead, hanging on the wall. Wouldn't that be a fitting end? There had to be some way out of this. But without a way to actually see what was holding him up, there was little chance he'd be able to find one. Perhaps the Coalition prison wasn't so bad after all. At least he'd been able to walk around, go to the restroom, eat on occasion, the simple things. There was only one thing he could do, and he wasn't looking forward to it. Suffocation had always been a fear, whether it was the vacuum of space or the inhospitable atmosphere of a rogue planet. Cass had spent his entire life always ensuring he'd be able to take his next breath. But it seemed like now was as good a time as any to stop. He sucked in as deep as he could, since he couldn't expand his chest, and held, counting in his head. He had no idea if this would do anything or not, but it was better than nothing. 10 seconds. No problem. 10 seconds was easy. 20 seconds. Little tougher. The desire to release the breath crept up the back of his throat. 30. His pulse quickened, his body trying to figure out what had happened to the oxygen. 40. He could feel the blood rising to his cheeks and the pressure on his chest, willing him to exhale and suck in some sweet, sweet oxygen. But he couldn't. He had to remain strong. 45. The pull to release seemed to double every second, but he would not relent. 55. Cass squeezed his eyes closed, forcing himself to hold on. 70. Thoughts were growing fuzzy. He was having difficulty focusing. 75. He had to hold on. 80. 85. Hold on. 90. Cass crumpled to the floor, sucking in gasps as hard as he could, risking hyperventilating. But slowly his breathing returned to normal. He snapped his head up, glancing around, but still unable to see anything. It didn't matter. He could move again. He waited a moment for his breathing to return to normal before he decided to move. Slowly, he scooted away from where he thought the wall was. There was no telling if he accidentally touched it when he tried to get up that it wouldn't pull him right back into immobilization again. As he moved, all of his joints tingled and spasmed, having been immobile much too long. He had to also wait for all feeling to return before he could stand up again. Though that might not be the best idea either. Would he even be able to leave this place? He and the Sill had passed through a door when they'd entered, and Zenfore had left the same way, the door almost turning to mist for her. Would it do the same for him, or remain solid? There was only one way to find out. Wait, his mind said. What's the play here? Get out of this room, then what? Go back to the shuttle? He couldn't go back. As much as he didn't like this place, returning to the shuttle and attempting to leave would be fruitless. They'd be on him immediately. They may even be on their way here now to restrain him again. But he couldn't let that happen. What he needed to do was find Zenfore, or someone else with as much power and influence on this ship, and get them to listen for 5 minutes. 5 minutes to avert disaster. That was all he needed. After ruminating everything over for hours, he was convinced he could make it happen. He just needed the chance. Cass crawled in the direction he thought the door should be, the metal beneath his hands cold. He was still unable to detect any vibration through the plates. Just what kind of ship didn't produce reverberations when it was moving through space? There should be at least something. But this ship was like a tomb. No sounds, no smells, dark and lonely. It was the worst place he'd ever been, and he wanted nothing more than to return home. Or at least let them shoot him out into space, where he could see some stars before he died. Maybe he should return to the shuttle. There would be a light inside he could use. It would at least give him some bearings on where he'd come from and where he was supposed to go. That was, assuming he could get out of here at all. Still crawling, he made his way forward until the plate sloped up slightly to what was definitely a wall. He felt around, wondering if this was the door or if he'd become turned around and was facing a different direction. He stood, making sure his hands led him up against the solid surface. This might not even be a door at all, in which case he'd have to make his way back around the room anyway. He tried to remember if he'd seen any other details in the dim light from Zenfore, or any of the other Zoras, but couldn't recall the thing. He felt around for a seam, some way for him to tell this was in fact a door, but only found smooth surface. He took a step back, making sure to keep his hand on the wall, hoping to trigger some mechanism that might let him leave. Unfortunately, it made no difference. This ship was so odd. Despite the metal plates, he couldn't feel a seam anywhere, and hadn't felt one on the floor either. Was this ship just one continuous piece of molded machinery? Cass took a deep breath and dropped his hand. The Sill wouldn't be stupid enough to allow him to leave this room, in the event he figured out how to remove the immobilization field. No. They would want to keep him in here until someone could come and restrain him again. He turned until he was facing 180 degrees from his previous spot and stepped forward. There should be another wall in front of him somewhere. He took another step. Nothing yet. He put his hands out in front of him, hoping to feel something, but they only swiped at air. Another few steps. Still nothing. He had to be a good 6 meters from where he'd fallen from the wall. The room hadn't been that big, had it? 3 more steps, each slightly more confident. He still hadn't run into anything yet. This was maddening. It was like being trapped in a midnight labyrinth. Someone would have to come for him eventually, right? He found himself wishing the person would come sooner rather than later, if for no other reason than to remind himself he hadn't gone absolutely mad in here. 3 more long steps. The room could not be this long. It wasn't possible. Not from what he'd seen when they brought him in. Had he passed through another door and not even known it? He reached out with his arms, spinning one way, then back the other, hoping they would touch something. But there was nothing. Somehow, the lack of walls was even worse than being held up against one. Was the ship even real? By leaving his wall, had he become lost in the folds between dimensions? And could he ever get out? There was only one thing to do. He continued walking forward. 27. Box tossed the small device aside, the show playing within not drawing his interest at all. He'd tried to get into it, but something he'd once found enjoyable he now found dull and unexciting. It seemed like everything, since he'd started spending time in sickbay, had fallen to the side. Was it possible he'd finally found something fulfilling in a short life? Nah, he said aloud, despite the room being empty. Can you imagine? Hi, Dr. Box. My balls hurt today. Well, let's take a look and see if we can't find the problem, he mocked in 2 different voices. First, he doubted anyone would let him see their balls. And second, there was no way anyone of the Coalition would ever certify him for anything other than assistant work, or maybe triage. Despite the fact he now had several centuries of medical knowledge stored in his systems. He'd even backed up the data to his secondary core in case he was in an accident and needed to be rebuilt. All he'd stored there before were his personality and memory routines, but now he had something much more important to store. He was grateful for Zax for allowing him to work beside her, but if this situation showed anything, it was how unevenly circumstances were stacked against him. If he could be pulled from anywhere and stored in a room with 0 evidence and nothing more than a suspicion from the captain, then how could he ever expect organics to see him as equal? Before he'd come aboard the Tempest, most people either ignored him or considered him Cass's helper/enforcer/love slave or whatever. The point was, they never paid him any mind. Until they'd become involved with Commander Diazol. She'd been the first one to call for his assistance back in Chatan to help those people escape from the Sargans. Not many other organics would have done that. She'd even vouched for him once she'd finished his evaluation after the incident with Lieutenant Rond. Maybe she thought she owed him for not giving her away that night she snuck on the reasonable excuse. Or maybe she really did see him as a fully autonomous person. But either way, she was the exception, not the rule. In his experience, most people would toss him into a recycler before claiming he could think for himself. He walked over to the comm panel on the wall, using it instead of his personal comm, as it might be more likely to get a response, since the show was coming from the ship itself and not him. Commander Diazol? Hello? He asked into the comm. No response. She must be otherwise occupied. She'd said she would get back in contact with him. Perhaps she was making a case for him to the captain right now. It was ridiculous he was cooped up in this room when he could be down in sickbay putting his skills to good use. If they were going back into Sill space, whether they decided to go after Cass first or not, he would be needed down there. They'd gotten away last time with barely a scrape. A second time, they wouldn't be so lucky. Cass, you stupid bastard. If they decided to leave him to his fate, wherever he'd shuttled off to, then Box might have a moral dilemma. He couldn't let him go off on his own forever. He'd have to find a way to get off the ship himself and go after him. Assuming he'd be able to track which way he went. He wouldn't have just left without a note or explanation if he wasn't planning on coming back. He had to have known how it would look, especially with a record like his. Box was lucky they hadn't taken more extreme actions. As he was thinking, the door to their quarters opened, revealing 2 people from the science wing, as designated by their uniforms, and 3 security officers.
Dr. Amargosa, Dr. Stevens, Ensign Follier, Crewman Unak, Crewman Tess.
"What can I do for you?" he asked, trying not to panic. This could be nothing but bad news, and Box didn't have a lot of time to decide how he wanted to handle it. He began calculating his odds.
"Box, please come with us,"
Dr. Amargosa said. She was tall, with clay-colored skin and dark brown eyes. He'd only ever seen her file, but knew she was in charge of the team that worked on and repaired all the drones the engineering team used for those tight spaces organics couldn't fit.
"Why?"
"I've been compliant," he said. They had nothing on him. This wasn't like last time when he lashed out against Rond. He'd been very careful to maintain his calm. No matter what he did, these organics were going to do what they wanted with him. He took a step back.
"Now, Box,"
Amargosa said, putting her hands up.
"I know we've never met before, but we need to check some things out. We've been getting some reports you might have a malfunction."
"And how many other sentient machines have you checked things out on?" he asked. Amargosa fumbled over her words.
"We're not. There's no definitive proof. I tell you what, we can look at that as well while we're making sure everything is working okay," she said, her voice too cheerful. "Just come with us down to Science 2. We've got a really nice facility down there."
Box tapped his comm.
"Commander? Commander, please respond. They're trying to abduct me."
Silence on the other end. What was going on? She wouldn't have turned it off. He took another step back. In response, the 3 security officers stepped forward, one of them producing a sealing bolt from his pocket. Box knew his eyes must be blinking like crazy, but they wouldn't know what that meant. All they knew was there was a machine on their ship they didn't have control over, and they meant to put him down. He could see it in the way Amargosa and Stevens approached him with such caution, as if he were a wild animal.
"Get Zax in here," Box said. "I'm not going anywhere without Zax." "The doctor is preoccupied at the moment," Amargosa said. "You can speak with her later."
Box tapped his comm again. As he did, he felt the magnetic pull of the bolt land on his chest. As he glanced down, he lost all control over his functions and crumpled into a pile on the floor, all his motor functions having been stalled.
"Wasn't that easier?"
Amargosa asked. She turned to one of the security officers.
"Let Paige know we have him, and we'll be transporting him down to Science 2.
Paige. If Box ever managed to find his way out of this, he was going to tear the man's head from his shoulders and bathe in his blood. The bastard deserved nothing else.
"You're telling me he went back to negotiate with the Sill? Alone?"
Greene sat across from Evie in his command room.
"That's what I believe, sir," she said. "I also believe he was unwittingly aided by Commander Sester, and to a lesser extent, Negotiator Laska."
"Laska?" Greene said, his eyes going wide.
"She's the last person I would have expected to help him escape."
Evie clenched her fist under the table and bore down, resetting herself.
"Again, he didn't escape. He left to negotiate with the Sill, as he was ordered to by the Admiral."
Greene put up his hand.
Fair enough. Still, Laska's not one to skirt the rule of law. In fact, she often sees to it. What did she have to do with this?
I'm not sure, Evie said, but computer logs track Cass going down to the bar before heading to engineering. I checked the sensors, and only one other person was in there at the same time. Laska. But all entertainment venues are closed during a shipwide emergency, Greene replied.
How did they...
They broke in. Or as best as I can tell, Laska broke in first, and Cass just happened to meet her there. They spent a few minutes together, then Cass made his way to engineering, where he stole the data and made his way to the shuttle.
But the data was destroyed,
Greene said. She nodded, throwing any leverage he thought he had out the airlock. He went in there blind and defenseless, and he didn't even realize it until it was too late. Greene leaned back, staring at the ceiling.
Which means he's probably dead.
As much as she didn't want to admit it, the captain was probably right. Still, she remained silent. There was no telling if he was alive or dead, since they knew so little about the Sill. Now the Sargans, on the other hand... Greene tapped his comm.
Send negotiator Laska up to see me immediately, he said.
Yes, Captain, Zal replied from the bridge.
What else? How bad is it?
He asked.
Sester, sir. I think he had an inkling of what Cass was doing, but neglected to tell anyone. He told me he shut off his mind from Cass so he wouldn't see what was happening.
Greene slumped back.
Damn. But it isn't as if we can punish him. The brig won't even hold him, not comfortably anyway.
I don't believe he did anything that would intentionally hurt the ship. He believed what Cass was doing was correct, and you know how the Claxians are about their moral code. Greene nodded.
I'm glad he has a hard time reading the two of us. If he knew what Rutledge had done, and it got back to the High Claxian Temple, I know, she said.
The Claxians had always been big on full transparency. It had been one of the conditions for them sharing their technology with humans when they'd first encountered each other over 2 millennia ago. Rutledge's actions with the Atlas could threaten everything.
Do you think he can read Cass? Greene asked.
I don't know. Maybe. Ensign Tyler said Cass barely talked the entire time. If he was communicating with Sester... The chime at the door rang.
Come in,
Greene said. The door opened to reveal Laska. A smug smile painted across her face.
You summoned?
She asked.
Take a seat, negotiator,
Greene said.
Thank you, Captain. Most kind.
She strode around the chair and lifted herself up into it, her legs no longer touching the floor below.
What do you know about Caspian Robeaux' disappearance? Greene asked.
What are you insinuating, Captain? Laska asked, her steel gaze zeroing in on Greene. Greene's eyes narrowed.
I'm not insinuating anything. I'm asking a question.
Laska turned to Evie, regarded her, then turned back to Greene.
I notice I am outnumbered in this situation. I would prefer to either have my own representative to assist me, or you can ask the commander to step outside a moment, she said.
I'm sorry if you feel as if I'm being unfair, Greene said, but the commander stays. Now please, answer the question.
As it is my right under Section 4 of the Sovereign Judicial Code, I formally request this line of questioning be performed in the presence of a third-party arbiter.
Greene leaned forward.
Don't quote regulations to me. You know as well as I do, the closest third-party arbiter is on Starbase 8, over 30 days away. And your reluctance to answer my question isn't doing you any favors, negotiator.
He stared at her, and she stared right back. Evie could feel the tension in the room increasing by the second.
You are quite right, Captain. But I must ask, are you denying me my rights as a Coalition citizen? One might say your determination to have your question answered in such a prompt manner is equally unfavorable.
For Corps' sake,
Greene said, standing and turning to his window. He clasped his hands behind his back.
I'm not trying to intimidate you here, Laska.
Xerxes, please, the negotiator said. All of my friends call me Xerxes.
All we're trying to do, Evie said, is figure out where Cass went and what his plans were.
Oh, Laska said, a smirk forming at the edges of her mouth.
Isn't it obvious? He went to perform his duty.
Then he told you he was going after the Sill alone, Greene said.
He didn't need to, Laska said. I could see it in him. He wasn't about to let this mission fail. Somewhere, under all that bravado and pain, is still a coalition officer. If spending the past few weeks with him has taught me anything, it's that.
What did you talk about? We know you met in the bar shortly before he departed.
We shared a drink, Laska said.
Anything else?
Greene asked. She only shrugged, extending her hands out in front of her.
I should have you arrested,
Greene said. Laska hopped off the chair, standing before the desk and staring up at him.
It's never wise to imprison a diplomat, Captain. It always comes back around to bite you in the end.
She didn't break eye contact.
If there was nothing else?
He gave a small shake of his head. Laska made a curt bow to both him and Evie and exited back through the doors.
Damn, she's arrogant, Greene scoffed. Negotiators.
Regardless of what she told him, I'd say we can be certain of where Cass was headed when he left.
Seems that way,
Greene replied.
How long until the ship is up and running again?
Evie checked her comm for the time.
Pearson down in engineering says another 45 minutes at best.
Greene turned back to the window.
Then we can only hope it's not too late to save him. For all our sakes.